Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that we all do every moment of every day without even thinking about it, and that is breathing.
Yeah,
We are going to explore the science behind how oxygen gets from the air into our bodies.
right.
And to help us along the way, we're going to be looking at the document gas laws.
Yeah, it's a process that seems really simple when you first think about it. But when you actually start to break it down, there's a lot going on.
Right, it's deceptively complex.
Yeah,
So anyone who's taken a biology class probably encountered this concept before.
right.
But we're going to go a little bit deeper today.
Yeah, for sure.
And hopefully we'll uncover some interesting facts and change the way you think about taking a breath.
Absolutely.
So one of the key things we need to understand about this process is diffusion.
Right.
And this basically explains how molecules move from high concentration areas to low concentration areas.
Yeah, it's like if you think about dropping some food coloring into a glass of water,
Right.
you can see the color spreading out until it's even throughout the glass.
Right, and that's diffusion in action.
Exactly, and that's how oxygen travels from the air in our lungs into our bloodstream.
Okay, so it's going from a place where there's more of it to a place where there's less of it.
That's right.
Makes sense.
But here's the thing that you might not know. Every breath that you take is mostly nitrogen, not oxygen.
Oh, really?
Yeah, nitrogen actually makes up about 78% of the air that we breathe.
Wow. I always thought that oxygen was the main gas we breathe.
Yeah, it's a common misconception.
So if we're mostly breathing in nitrogen, how does that help us get the oxygen that we need?
Well, that's where Dalton's law comes in.
Okay.
This law tells us that each gas in a mixture contributes to the total pressure in proportion to its percentage.
Okay.
So even though oxygen is a smaller percentage of the air, it still exerts its own partial pressure.
Okay.
And that pressure is what drives the oxygen into our bloodstream.
So it's not just the overall pressure that matters, but also the pressure of each individual gas.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And is that why oxygen flows from our lungs into our blood, even though there's already some oxygen in our blood?
Exactly. It's all about that difference in partial pressure between the air in our lungs and the blood in our capillaries.
So the oxygen wants to go where there's less of it.
Right. And the same principle applies to carbon dioxide moving out of our blood and into the air we exhale.
Oh, so it works both ways.
Absolutely. It's a constant exchange.
So it's like a two-way street with gases constantly moving back and forth based on their individual pressures.
Exactly.
So we talked about oxygen. Now, what about carbon dioxide? It's not as abundant as nitrogen or oxygen, so does it even really matter?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Even though it's a smaller percentage, carbon dioxide is actually much more soluble in our blood than oxygen is.
Okay, so solubility is another factor here.
Right.
Now, I remember learning about Henry's law a while back,
Okay.
and it states that the amount of gas that can dissolve in a liquid depends on the pressure of that gas above the liquid.
Yeah, you got it. It's a key concept here.
So if you think about it, carbon dioxide is kind of like salt, which dissolves really easily in water.
Okay.
Oxygen, on the other hand, is more like sugar. It dissolves, but not as easily.
Right.
And then you have nitrogen, which is like oil. It barely mixes at all.
Good analogy.
So this difference in solubility is really important for understanding how gases behave in our bodies.
Exactly.
But now I have a question for you.
Okay.
Why is nitrogen's low solubility a problem for scuba divers?
That's a great question, and we will definitely come back to that a little bit later.
Okay.
For now, though, let's shift our focus to how these gas laws are working inside of our bodies, specifically in our lungs and blood vessels.
All right, sounds good. I'm ready to dive a little deeper.
Okay, so let's start by talking about the pulmonary vein.
Okay,
So this vein carries freshly oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart.
right.
And in this blood, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 100 millimeters of mercury, or millimetrograms for short,
Okay.
while the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is much lower, only around 40 millimeters curenes.
So in the oxygenated blood, the oxygen's partial pressure is high and carbon dioxide's is low because it's been expelled into the lungs.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Now let's look at the pulmonary artery, which carries deoxygenated blood from the heart back to the lungs.
Okay.
And in this blood, the situation is flipped.
Okay.
The partial pressure of oxygen is lower at about 40 millimeter Hg, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher, about 45 millimeter Hg.
So that difference in partial pressure between the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein is what drives the exchange of gases in our lungs.
Exactly.
But then wouldn't reaching an equilibrium mean that there's no more exchange of gases?
That's a great question. And you're right, if our bodies reached equilibrium, then gas exchange would stop.
So how does our body prevent that?
Well, our bodies are really smart, and they've developed a system that constantly disrupts that equilibrium.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this ensures that there's always a continuous supply of oxygen going to our cells, and that carbon dioxide is being removed.
So it's like a finely tuned dance between our circulatory system, our respiratory system, and how much energy our tissues are using at any given moment.
Exactly. It's a really dynamic process.
It's amazing to think that such a thin membrane in our lungs is responsible for keeping us alive.
It really is a marvel of biological engineering, and it all comes down to how efficiently gas exchange happens in our lungs. And we'll delve more into that after a quick break.
All right, I can't wait to hear more.
We'll be right back.
All right, so right before the break, we were discussing just how amazing and efficient our lungs are at gas exchange.
Right. It's pretty remarkable.
So tell me more about what actually makes this process so efficient.
Well, one of the main things is that concentration gradient, that big difference between the partial pressure of the air in our lungs and the blood in our capillaries that we just talked about.
Right.
And the larger that difference is, the faster diffusion happens.
So it's kind of like if you're rolling a ball down a hill,
Yeah,
the steeper that hill is, the faster the ball rolls.
exactly.
So the bigger that pressure difference is, the faster the gas moves.
Exactly. And then there's also the distance that the gases have to travel, which is incredibly small.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're talking like 0.5 micrometers here, which is actually thinner than a human hair.
That's unbelievable.
It is. And this tiny distance means that the gases don't have to travel very far, so it makes that exchange process really fast.
Right, so it's like a super short commute.
Yeah, exactly. And to add to that, both oxygen and carbon dioxide are lipid soluble,
Oh, right.
meaning they can pass through cell membranes pretty easily.
So they're like little tiny submarines.
Yeah, I like that.
Just slipping through the walls of our cells?
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, our lungs have an enormous surface area for gas exchange.
Really? How big are we talking?
Well, about the size of a tennis court.
Wow, that's way bigger than I ever would have imagined.
Yeah, it's all thanks to the structure of our lungs and all those tiny little air sacs called alveoli.
Right.
This huge surface area allows for plenty of space for all this gas exchange to be happening.
So we've got steep concentration gradients, we've got short distances, lipid-soluble gases, and a massive surface area.
Yeah,
It's like the perfect setup for efficient gas exchange.
absolutely it is. And we can't forget about the coordination of the blood and airflow in our lungs.
Right.
So our respiratory system is kind of like a well-conducted orchestra, right, where you have the air and blood flowing together,
In sync.
yeah, to make sure that fresh air is constantly being supplied to the right areas.
It's like a beautiful dance.
It is.
Now, I remember you said that we come back to my question about scuba divers
Oh, right, yeah.
and nitrogen's low solubility.
Yeah.
Can you explain why that's a problem for them?
Sure. So when a scuba diver descends deep underwater, the pressure increases a lot.
Right.
And as we know from Henry's law, this higher pressure forces more nitrogen to dissolve into their blood.
Okay.
So the deeper they go, the more nitrogen is getting absorbed.
Makes sense.
Now imagine the diver ascending back to the surface too quickly.
Okay.
The pressure drops really rapidly.
Oh.
And all that dissolved nitrogen suddenly wants to come out of the solution.
Oh, no.
It's like opening up a shaken up soda bottle,
Right.
but inside the body,
That sounds really painful.
it can be. Yeah, and those nitrogen bubbles, they can form in the bloodstream and tissues, and they cause a lot of different symptoms like joint pain, dizziness,
Oh, wow.
even paralysis, and in severe cases, it can even be fatal.
Wow, that's a little scary.
Yeah, and that's what's known as decompression sickness, or the bends.
Right, the bends. Yeah, I've heard of that.
So it's a really good example of how our bodies are constantly interacting with the gases around us, even when we're not really thinking about it.
Right, and also how important it is to actually understand gas behavior.
Right, especially in activities like scuba diving.
Right, so the divers need to monitor their depth and their ascent rate carefully to avoid this decompression sickness.
Exactly right.
It's fascinating how all this seemingly basic science has such a huge impact.
It really does. Now, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide and
Yeah.
nitrogen, the main players. Exactly. But what about the other gases present in the air?
Yeah, like water vapor.
Right.
I mean, they're not as abundant as those other gases, so do they even really play a role?
So they might not be the stars of the show, but they're definitely still part of the mix.
Okay.
So while they don't directly participate in the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide,
Right.
they do contribute to the overall partial pressure of the air that we breathe.
So even though they're not as abundant, they still play a role.
Exactly. Every component of the air we breathe, even the seemingly insignificant ones, contribute to the overall balance of gases in our bodies.
Wow, it really is a beautifully complex system, and it's amazing how all these pieces work together.
It really is, and there's still so much more to explore about this process.
Okay, well, let's keep buying then and dive into this fascinating world of trace gases and their impact.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right, so before we got sidetracked, we were talking about the trace gases in the air, besides the big ones like oxygen and carbon dioxide and nitrogen.
Right, those trace gas.
So what about them? What role do they play?
Well, even though they're only present in super tiny amounts,
Right.
they can actually have a pretty big impact.
Like I said, it's amazing how even the tiniest things can have a big impact in science.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all connected.
For example, air pollution introduces harmful gases into our system.
Right, like carbon monoxide.
Yeah, carbon monoxide from car exhaust or ozone from industrial emissions.
Right,
Those are the big ones, and they can really interfere with how oxygen is transported in our bodies.
right.
And that obviously can have serious consequences for our health.
It's a reminder that the air we breathe isn't always clean and that we really need to make sure we have access to clean air.
Absolutely, clean air is so important,
It's essential for our well-being.
for sure. And it makes you think twice about just, taking a deep breath when you're in a really polluted city.
Yeah, exactly.
And beyond pollution, there's also the world of naturally occurring trace gases.
Oh, right.
Some of them are released by plants,
Okay.
like volatile organic compounds.
Okay.
And those are actually what contribute to the sense of forests and flowers.
Oh, that's interesting. So even these tiny components of the air can have an impact on us,
Right.
either our health or, in this case, our senses.
Exactly. It's a whole hidden world that we don't often think about.
Right under our noses, literally.
And there's still so much that we don't know about these trace gases.
Yeah, who knows what secrets they hold.
Lots of potential discoveries waiting to be made.
It makes me want to go back to school and become a researcher.
Well, it's a constantly evolving field, and there's always something new to learn.
That's true.
The more we learn, the more we realize just how much more there is to know.
Yeah, it really highlights how everything is interconnected.
Exactly.
Well, I have to say this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Thank
I've
you.
learned so much about the gas laws and how they impact us every single day.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey talking about everything from basic diffusion to the complexities of gas exchange in our bodies and in the environment.
It's amazing how much we covered in such a short amount of time.
Right.
We talked about the importance of partial pressure and that thing about how we breathe mostly nitrogen, not oxygen.
Yeah.
It was really interesting to learn about decompression sickness for scuba divers and the impact of air pollution.
Absolutely. It's been a really thorough exploration of the world of gases.
Right. And hopefully our listeners have come away with a new appreciation for this topic.
Yeah, for sure.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that breathing is something we often take for granted.
Right.
But every breath we take is a testament to this amazing interplay between physics, chemistry, and biology.
Right.
It's really a process that sustains us, connects us to the world around us.
Yeah.
And I think it's worthy of our awe and appreciation.
Well said. That's a beautiful way to put it.
Thanks.
It really is a reminder of how much we depend on these fundamental principles, even when we're not conscious of them.
Absolutely. And hopefully this discussion has sparked some curiosity in our listeners and encouraged them to explore the world of gases even further.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
To our listeners, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep breathing deeply.
And we'll see you next time.